Hi guys, it's me, ChazzaHD, and welcome to another Grand Prix in 2023, race 11 of the season, and this Grand Prix is pretty much the halfway point of the 2023 Formula 1 season, and we are here this weekend at the Hungaroring in Budapest for the Hungarian Grand Prix of 2023. Hope you guys are doing well. Obviously, we've had a couple of weeks break since the last race at Silverstone. We've had so many races, it feels like, in the last few weeks, and we have absolutely blown by them, and now we only have 2 races to go until the summer break. And those 2 races, this one this weekend, and the next weekend, we're racing at Spa. And then, 4 weeks summer break. So, it has really flown by, these last few races, especially the European races. But after Silverstone, which wasn't the greatest weekend, qualifying was incredibly exciting. The race definitely failed to deliver what we were hoping. But given how close it is throughout the field at the minute, and how many surprises we have in the field at the minute, with teams rising dramatically up the field to positions they were absolutely nowhere near earlier this season, or even in the previous few years, it really has made things very interesting going forward. And given that this track that we're racing at, the Hungaroring, very short track, not very short, but it's a shorter racetrack than what we get at Silverstone. And normally qualifying and the gaps we're getting qualifying are quite small at times. So it should be a very, close weekend. Maybe not the greatest race we're going to get on Sunday, but it's going to be definitely a very competitive weekend, at least behind the best team in Formula 1 right now by far, which of course is Red Bull Racing. And of course, this weekend we have the trial of a new qualifying format where in qualifying in Q1 the teams will only be allowed to use the hard compound tire. In Q2 they'll only be allowed to use the the medium compound tire, and then in Q3 they'll only be allowed to use the soft compound tire. It's a terrible format, terrible idea. Whoever came up with it should be literally banned from, any F1 racetrack, really for life, because it's an incredibly stupid idea. It's not going to add anything. I just don't understand why they're even trialing such an idea, because, if you compare it to previous failed qualifying formats, this has, I think, a guaranteed chance of not working. When, if you guys remember Bernie Ecclestone's failed qualifying format at the start of 2016, which was really the death knell of him running Formula 1, even though it was a terrible format, that format had a chance of being, good and being exciting in certain aspects. This format we're trialing this weekend, I really think is just guaranteed not to work. I don't see what excitement can come out of it. The only thing of interest is certain teams will perform better on certain compounds, but who really cares about that? Certainly the casuals that Liberty Media advertise to absolutely don't give a fuck about that. And even us diehards, I don't think care massively about that sort of stuff. So it's really just a stupid idea, and I don't think it will have any effect on the weekend. It's a shame though that it's going to be something that we have to factor in this weekend, because it's just such, again, a stupid idea. But we'll see how the idea plays out, and if it does anything of note, or maybe we'll just forget that it ever was a rule because of the just absolute non-effect that it will have, most likely, on qualifying, and not only on qualifying, but the weekend overall. But, of course, tonight, guys, is the weekend preview. And as usual, we're going to get into how I think the teams will do around this track. Look at the track and get into what type of car you need to have to really be quick here at the Hungaroring. We'll also do some comparative sectors from tracks we've recently been to, where, certain parts of the tracks we've recently been to are comparable to parts of the Hungaroring, just to get an idea of what type of cars should work well in certain parts of the track. Then we'll get into my initial qualifying and race predictions going into the weekend. Obviously, those predictions are not final. Another thing we'll get into as well is early news and pictures about upgrades for this weekend's race. And there has been a slight storm today of news when it comes to upgrades, because Red Bull have brought this weekend their biggest upgrade of the season by far, and I cannot wait to show you guys. And it revolves around the side pod. It's not massively, from what I can see, I don't think it's going to be an absolute game changer. I don't think they're going to be suddenly half a second quicker. I mean, I know Adrian Newey is an absolute aero god, but I would be surprised if they started going, half a second or more quicker with this new side pod that they've got. But I think definitely, if it does work like it should, Red Bull should be able to maintain their advantage at least for another few races and maybe keep up this record of winning so many races in a row. There's also other upgrades this weekend for other teams. We'll try and get into that as well. We'll be able to obviously get more into that tomorrow night when I do my qualifying preview, once we have the confirmed list of upgrades to go through. But we'll get into that as well. And then obviously I'll get into in depth why I think the teams will end up with the results I've gone for the weekend. But before we get into all of that, let's get into the championship standings coming out of the British Grand Prix. So, Max Verstappen, 99 points clear of Sergio Perez. A massive gap to Perez. And there is a realistic chance that Max could wrap up the title before the end of September. And between now and the end of September, we've got this race here in Hungary, next weekend in Spa, and then after the summer break we have a double header at Zandvoort and Monza, and then a couple weeks after that a double header of Singapore and Japan. Very good chance, like I said, that he'll get it wrapped up probably once again at Suzuka, because I mean the gap he has to Perez, and I think I saw this the other day, that after the first 10 races this is the biggest gap I think anyone has had compared to second in the championship, I think possibly ever in the history of Formula One. So yeah, just an incredible dominance by Max Verstappen. Of course, he has been brutally consistent ever since the Miami Grand Prix, where since then he has won, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 races in a row. And given his current form, if he wins this weekend, which, I mean, the Hungaroring is not exactly his best track necessarily. It's a good track for him, but not his absolute best, on the calendar. Given that the next 2 races after that are at Spa and Zandvoort, tracks that we know he absolutely loves and he's unbelievably quick at, he could win legitimately 10 races in a row. He really, really could. With the form he's in and the way the Red Bull car's looking, with this upgrade as well, Verstappen could break all sorts of records in 2023. Fernando Alonso not too far behind Sergio Perez, but of course Alonso didn't have a great British Grand Prix, nor did Aston Martin. Lewis Hamilton 4th in the championship, with Carlos Sainz in 5th, just a point ahead of George Russell in 6th. Charles Leclerc in 7th place. And then Stroll in 8th, Norris 9th, and Esteban Ocon down to P10. Lando Norris, I do expect to be up to 8th in the championship by the conclusion of the weekend. And on the constructors' side, Red Bull Racing now leading by 208 points, an incredible gap over Mercedes-Benz, who are in second. Aston Martin are in third, 22 points behind. Aston Martin, we do believe, are bringing upgrades this weekend. Not sure how many, and I think they might be bringing some more at Spa next week, and then probably after the summer break at Zandvoort as well. So upgrades are coming for Aston Martin, but I'll be honest, I think their chances of beating Mercedes in the championship are not looking very good at all. Not just because of where their car is right now, comparatively on performance compared to Mercedes, but given that they've only got really one driver to rely on, it's looking very tough for Aston Martin to finish second in the championship. Ferrari are in P4, 24 points behind Aston Martin. McLaren, of course, after that brilliant Silverstone Grand Prix, they are up to 5th place and are 98 points behind Ferrari. And given how quick McLaren are right now, and they're also not done with upgrades, I don't think it's impossible for McLaren to catch Ferrari and Aston Martin ahead of them. I really don't think it is impossible. I mean, if Lando Norris finishes on the podium this weekend again, and Piastri finishes 5th or 6th, that's another 20 plus points. And you'd have to imagine Ferrari or Aston Martin will have not a great weekend in comparison to McLaren this weekend, as we'll get into in a moment with my thoughts as to who will be where. So yeah, McLaren, watch out for them. I think they could definitely catch those two teams ahead of them. I think McLaren catching Mercedes, though, will probably be a bit too hard because Mercedes are, just that bit further away and obviously have two really great drivers who are able to consistently score good points for them. But yeah, Aston Martin and Ferrari, I don't think are completely out of reach for the McLaren team. Alpine are in 6th place. Williams now up to P7, their highest place in the championship they've been in since 2017, where, of course, that year they finished 5th in the championship. Haas are in 8th, with Alfa Romeo 9th, and AlphaTauri, of course, who have replaced Nick de Vries with Daniel Ricciardo, who will be racing for AlphaTauri for the rest of the year. AlphaTauri last in the championship, and given how their car looks at the minute, I'd be very surprised if they were to, rise from 10th in the championship. Very surprised indeed, given how their car looks. Not comfortably the worst car on the grid, but it's not really, given how other teams look right now, they don't really look like they're anywhere near fighting for a point at the minute, when, of course, a few races ago with Yuki Tsunoda, it was a bit of a regular occurrence, them fighting for a point. Anyway, let's get into this Hungarian Grand Prix weekend and look at the map of the circuit. So the yellow line is the first sector, the red is the middle sector, and the blue is the final sector. So the first sector is the by far most power dominant, and the first sector is not really that important because it doesn't really represent what this track is about. This track is very, in certain areas, it can be very street circuit, like with how tight the circuit is and how many, especially in the middle sector, where you can see with turn, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, how the corners come at you very, very quickly. And it is a very tough racetrack for the drivers. And you also do get to see really what drivers are, at least at the minute, performing to a very high standard around a track like this, because it does require a very highly skilled driver to really master this circuit. Final sector, you have a couple slow corners. The final corner is, in the race, it's slow, but in the qualifying, you can take it quite quickly. But yeah, the final sector is important to a degree, but really, it's about the middle sector. If you're going to be quick here, it's all about the middle sector. But unfortunately, because there has been so many upgrades to the cars in the last few weeks, and the last time we came to a track like this was the Circuit de Catalunya which was what? We were at that Grand Prix, 6 to 8 weeks ago? Like I said, there's been so many upgrades since then that we can't really get a good idea from what happened at that race in Spain in the first week of June. We can't really get a good idea as to who will perform well around here from that particular weekend. The only sector I've been able to compare to a track we've recently been to is the first sector in Hungary. I've decided to compare to the first sector at Silverstone, which is, again, similar. You have 2 longish on-throttle sections, a couple slow corners, and yeah, it's the most comparable that I could find as of recent to the first sector in Hungary. Ferrari and Red Bull were very quick in that first sector. McLaren looked pretty good as well. Williams were very quick. I do expect them to be very fast in the first sector here in Hungary, but in the middle and final sector, I think they will struggle a bit more. Mercedes and Aston Martin were doing okay. Aston Martin was struggling a bit more, to be honest, than I expected. At the British Grand Prix weekend, Alpine didn't look that great. And then Haas, Alfa Romeo, and AlphaTauri were a bit further behind. But again, compared to the middle and final sector, again, if you compare it to the Red Bull Ring or Silverstone, no part of those racetracks really is comparable to the middle and final sector here at the Hungaroring. So again, it is hard to compare, or not hard to compare, it's hard to say absolutely who should be quick in those parts of the circuit. But because the Hungaroring is a high aero track, it really does showcase if you've got really good levels of downforce, and if you have the best amount of downforce throughout the field, this circuit will show that, no doubt about it. And given how things look at the moment, you would have to say, going into the weekend, and this is purely, when I talk about the pecking order here, this is purely when it comes to qualifying, you'd have to say Red Bull still favourites to be the quickest, and then McLaren second, from what we saw at Silverstone, especially in the corners there where their car was quite clearly quicker than the Mercedes and the Ferrari and the Aston Martin as well. And then after McLaren, you'd probably have to say Mercedes third, Ferrari fourth, maybe joint quickest, fourth quickest with Aston Martin. It's hard to say because obviously Aston Martin are bringing an upgrade this weekend. I do expect Aston Martin definitely to perform better this weekend than what we saw at Silverstone. Alpine then in sixth, probably then with, I'm not sure, Haas or Williams seventh or eighth. Hard to say exactly. And then the final 2 teams should be Alfa Romeo and AlphaTauri. But yeah, given what we saw at Silverstone, Red Bull, McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, Aston Martin, I'm pretty confident that's what the pecking order will be when it comes to qualifying, at least for the top 5 teams here in Budapest this weekend. And given that, let's get into my initial predictions going into the race weekend. We'll start qualifying. So I'm going Max Verstappen on pole position, just ahead of Lando Norris, who will be alongside him on the front row yet again, just like he was at Silverstone. The reason, after all the hype I gave about McLaren after Silverstone, about how McLaren could be on pole position here, if Red Bull had not brought this side pod upgrade that I'll get into in a moment, then I probably would have gone for a McLaren pole position. But with that upgrade Red Bull have brought, I think McLaren are bringing something as well this weekend, which should limit how much Red Bull improved by compared to them. I that's why I've gone for a Red Bull pole position, because of that upgrade, really. Max Verstappen, I think, will be on pole from Lando Norris in second. Third and fourth on the second row of the grid, I think, will be Lewis Hamilton and George Russell. Mercedes definitely are going to have a good weekend, at least when it comes to fighting for the podium. I don't think they've got the pace to be fighting for pole position or the race win, definitely not. But podium-wise, I think they've got the pace definitely to get it. At Silverstone, we have to be honest, even though they were quicker in the race than Ferrari and Aston Martin. Mercedes did not really deserve to be on the podium at Silverstone. It really should have been Verstappen and then the two McLarens of Norris and Piastri. So, yeah, this will definitely be a better weekend for Mercedes, and I expect them to be definitely more competitive compared to McLaren than what we saw a couple weeks ago. And then fifth on the grid, I've gone Oscar Piastri. The reason I've gone for him in fifth is because the last time he raced here in Hungary, Oscar, was 2020 in Formula 3, and I went back and looked at what his pace was like that weekend. He did finish on the podium, I think, in both races, but in qualifying was not that quick. So yeah, that's why I've gone for him down in P5. And as well, really, there's not enough data to convince me that Oscar is going to be, very, very quick this weekend. So that's why I've gone with him down in P5, which, I mean, if he qualified fifth, that wouldn't be a bad result. He could still get a great result from there in the race. And then sixth, Charles Leclerc. I don't think Ferrari are going to be that quick this weekend. I don't think their pace compared to McLaren and Mercedes, at least in qualifying, is going to be that bad. They'll still be close and competitive with those teams, but I just don't think Ferrari, for this track layout, I just don't think they've got a car as good as the Red Bull, McLaren, or Mercedes cars. And maybe if Aston Martin's upgrade works well, there's a chance they probably won't have as good of a car as Aston Martin for this circuit, who I believe will be just behind them on the grid. Fernando Alonso, I'm going in P7, with Carlos Sainz in 8th. Sergio Perez, I do believe, will make Q3 for the first time since Miami. But given that this is not a track he has ever really been quick at, and I looked at his pace comparatively compared to Verstappen at this track last year, yeah, it's even if he makes Q3, his pace is going to be quite poor. So that's why I've gone for him in P9, just over half a second off his teammate. And then completing the top 10, I'm going to go Pierre Gasly in the Alpine. Watch out for Gasly. He has always been very quick at the Hungaroring. There was a couple races here for AlphaTauri where he was very, very quick. So yeah, watch out for him this weekend in terms of maybe causing a surprise. And I think for Alpine, we also have an upgrade for them this weekend, but I'm not sure it's as big as what it will be for the other teams. And then for the race, here's my prediction for the race with the predicted gaps as well. Max Verstappen, I think, will win the race from Lando Norris in second, Lewis Hamilton third, Russell fourth, Piastri fifth. Yep, no change to the top 5. I don't think it's going to be the greatest race this weekend, to be honest. I think qualifying is probably going to be the highlight of the weekend. Sergio Perez will make it up to 6th place because the Red Bull will be, obviously, the best car out there on Sunday, as it always is. Fernando Alonso will finish in P7, ahead of the two Ferraris of Leclerc and Sainz, 8th and 9th. And then Pierre Gasly will round out the points in P10. And yeah, you might be thinking, if you are a Ferrari fan, you might be thinking, why on earth have you predicted us to be 8th and 9th in the race and 6th and 8th in qualifying? Are we really that bad? It's not that Ferrari are bad. Again, going back to this prediction on qualifying, again, the position is bad, but when you look at the comparative pace, it's still close. That's what I think it will be, of course. So I'm not, I don't think Ferrari are going to be miles off McLaren and Mercedes in qualifying, or even Red Bull, but I just don't think this is a Ferrari track. We've seen this season at more so power tracks that Ferrari, that's where they produce their best form. This isn't a power track, and that's why, if you're a Ferrari fan, the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa next weekend will be the better weekend. Because Ferrari, of course, have the most powerful engine on the grid. And to be honest, I could see Ferrari probably having a decent chance at pole position at Spa. That's not a guarantee, of course, but I think, yeah, there's a good chance for Ferrari to have a great weekend at Spa. But this track, again, I just don't think suits their car as well as it does for the Red Bull, McLaren, or Mercedes teams, or even the Aston Martin team. And then when it comes to my race prediction, the reason I've gone with them finishing so far away from McLaren and Mercedes is because, as we saw at Silverstone, they still have a race pace issue, and they still cannot look after their tyres as well as other teams. So, yeah, still a lot of work to do at Ferrari. Of course, there should be really one final big upgrade left in the tank for the Ferrari team, which will probably come at the Dutch Grand Prix, which of course is a week before the home race at Monza, where Ferrari, if that upgrade, whatever upgrade it is, if it really works for them, maybe they could give themselves a decent chance of winning their home race. But this weekend is going to be definitely an off weekend for the Scuderia. But those are my predictions, initial predictions again, coming into the weekend. But before we go on to the teams, let me just get up on Twitter, and then I'll show on the screen in a moment some of the upgrades for this weekend. And hello, by the way, to all of you in chat. Hello to Nib as well, who says, where is the AlphaTauri option for the poll? And the poll he's talking about, of course, is currently running in the chat, and I've asked you guys who is most likely to challenge Red Bull this weekend at the Hungarian Grand Prix. The options are McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, and Aston Martin. Let me know who you think is most likely to put up a fight against Red Bull. In my view, it's McLaren, but let me know whether you disagree or not. Right, so let me just try and find some pictures, if I can, of these upgrades. Again, tomorrow we'll have official confirmation of everyone's upgrades and who has brought what. Right, I think we'll start with the big one. Of course, is is Red Bull Racing. So we'll go to here and we'll look at the comparison pictures. So here is a one comparison photo showing the difference in the inlet area of the side pod. As you can see here on the right hand side, this is the new inlet, side pod inlet for the side pod. And here on the left is the old one. This isn't the best picture to show it, but I just want to show this anyway, just so you can get a decent idea as to the smaller inlet they've gone for there. But there are also better pictures. Here you can see the difference. So on the bottom is the old side pod, and here is the new one. So just a bit tighter there on the inlet, and also just a bit of a different shape to that area as well. Again, I don't think necessarily this upgrade is absolutely massive for them. I don't think it's going to give them like an extra half a second or more. I'd be very surprised if it gave them that, because I don't think it's enough of I don't think it's big enough of an upgrade to really do that, but this will probably give them an extra, you'd imagine, 2, maybe 3 tenths of a second at most. And here's another comparison picture. So you can see here the on the bottom, the old Red Bull side pod, and on the top here, the new one. They have also changed the design of the side pod heading down to the floor. Looks a bit more I don't really want to say it looks more like the Aston Martin side pod, but it's more so following on in that direction. But it's definitely not really anything quite close to the Aston Martin side pod. But just a redesign, as you can see, to the side pod area. Again, not an absolutely massive redesign, not like what we saw with the McLaren in Austria, where they completely changed their side pod design. Or what we saw, obviously, with Mercedes and other teams as well. But this is their main upgrade, and really should be their biggest upgrade of the season, really, for Red Bull. And here also is another picture just showing the differences around the inlet area. So you can see on the bottom is the old side pod, and here is the new one here, and you can see with the hand pointing the difference compared to the old one. And I think there's another picture that I can find that shows from this angle it in a better way, but I'll try and find that in a minute if I can. See if there's any other upgrades that I can find. Normally Albert posts loads of photos with new parts, and apparently new flaps on the front wing for Red Bull. Yeah, looks to be a slight difference, but nothing massive there for Red Bull. Here's a new front wing for Alpine. You may have remembered, what was it, a few races ago, Alpine brought a front wing where there was a cutout on the top of the top flap of the wing, and now they brought another alteration which is kind of to do with that, and you can see, as Albert's saying here, a double cutlet on the Alpine's front wing top flap, and you can see the shape quite a bit different to what we've seen before from Alpine, but also quite a bit different to other teams on the grid, because if you compare this shape, you follow my mouse, of this Alpine front wing there, if you compare that to the new Red Bull front wing, the Red Bull front wing's a lot more straight and has less, up, down to it. So Alpine really on their own track when it comes to the front wing design, with something that is quite a bit different from really anything that any other team's brought so far this season. But let me just come away from this a second, and I'll try and find a couple pictures which are better. And yeah, this is the one I wanted to show. I'll get this back on screen. So this is from Formula Data Analysis, which is, by the way, a great Twitter account to follow. If you have Twitter, make sure to follow them. This comparison picture is just showing the evolution, really, of the side pod inlet from, you can see here, launch spec at the start of the year. Version 2, you can see it's a bit tighter, this area, than it was before. And then the newest area, even smaller than it was before. So just continuing to make it smaller and smaller. Of course, Adrian Newey, an aero god, as we know, and I'm sure that this will definitely have a good effect on the Red Bull car. Again, I don't think it's going to be absolutely massive, but it should definitely give them, extra lap time, just not an absolutely massive amount, that would, say, guarantee them to be winning, all of the races remaining this season. And just seeing here in regards to those Red Bull updates, that Sam Collins, who you guys might know, he works for F1 TV. He's like the tech guy at F1 TV. Has said regarding these upgrades that he thinks Red Bull were extremely clever with the redesign of the radiators, as they don't use any wind tunnel allocation. He basically calls it a free upgrade. He also thinks that the upgrade would be worth more than 2/10. When he says more than 2/10, I'm not sure exactly what that means, to be honest. Yeah, if I was to guess how much this upgrade will improve the Red Bull pace, again, quarter of a second, a third of a second, probably at most, is what I think it will do. But that is really interesting that, what do you call it? That Sam Collins is saying that Red Bull, extremely clever with the redesign of the radiators as they don't use any wind tunnel allocation. So, as he said, if that all is indeed true, that, it is essentially a free upgrade that doesn't come out of the amount of wind tunnel time they have remaining. And obviously, that depends really at this part of the season. Now that we're in the second half of the year, it really depends on how much money they've got left to spend on developing the car. So, yeah, this won't be the last Red Bull upgrade for sure, because Verstappen, I think after Silverstone, did talk about the that they were bringing something to Hungary, and then he said that they were probably going to bring something after the summer break as well. I would imagine, and really this goes for not all of the teams, but definitely more so the top teams, that once we complete the European season, I think the top teams will pretty much have stopped developing their car, because they won't really have, what do you call it? They won't really have enough to, I mean, even if they've got an extra whatever million left to spend on development, it's not probably going to gain them a massive amount of time that would mean that they should absolutely continue developing this year's car. I do think, though, teams like possibly Williams, AlphaTauri, maybe Alpine, McLaren to a certain extent, I think could probably bring an upgrade or two when we get into like the latter part of September, October. But yeah, definitely the Red Bull, Mercedes, Aston Martin, Ferrari. I expect them to be finished really by the time the European season is over. But that is all of the information when it comes to upgrades so far. Again, we'll know more tomorrow once we get the confirmed list of not just Red Bull, but all the teams and exactly what they brought. I really do hope that Aston Martin have brought a couple big, or at least important bits to their car to try and up the pace after what was a disappointing British Grand Prix. Would be nice as well to see Alpine, maybe with that front wing I showed, or maybe a bit extra than that. It would be nice to see Alpine get a bit better as well, because they've really dropped off the ball in the last 2 or 3 races in 2023. Anyway, let's now go on to the teams and get into how I think they'll do this weekend. We'll start with Red Bull Racing, and yeah, because of that upgrade, I think that's what keeps them ahead of McLaren and keeps them as the quickest team this weekend. If it wasn't for that upgrade, I probably would have gone for a McLaren pole position and possibly a McLaren race win as well. But yeah, Red Bull, just when they needed something to give them, that extra couple tenths of a second, they brought it at the absolute most critical time, because obviously Red Bull, they're going to win the drivers and constructors titles. We knew this at the start of the season, but I think now their main focus is to break records in 2023. They want to win not just so many races in a row. They want to win every race this season, because if they do win every race this season, they'll go down as the only team in history to have done that, until maybe somebody else does it in the future. So that's why Red Bull are not, quite giving up on 2023, even though they've got a massive advantage in the championship. Over 200 points clear in the constructors. Max Verstappen, 120 points plus clear of the nearest driver that is not his teammate. So, yeah, Red Bull, that's really what their main focus is. And with that upgrade now coming to the track, definitely improves their chances of winning every race in 2023. As for this weekend, if they're going to win this weekend, it's really all about qualifying. The record of, winning from pole position in certain eras here at the Hungaroring has been good, but in other times has not been the greatest. But given that it is a hard track to overtake at in certain areas, it is still very, very important to get pole position, given how tight the racetrack is in certain parts. And really, the only threat to Red Bull not winning the race this weekend is really them, screwing up qualifying. Because if they were to screw up qualifying and have a really poor session and somehow not end up with pole position and end up not even on the front row because of some reliability issue or just something going wrong for them, kind of like what we saw in qualifying at this track last year where they were 10th and 11th on the grid, didn't stop them winning, of course, then, yeah, that would be the only thing that could really scupper those chances. But as long as Max Verstappen, as long as he gets pole position, I just don't see how Max is going to be stopped in the race. Because in race conditions, the Red Bull is still too quick for the nearest teams. McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, and Aston Martin. So yeah, qualifying really is the most important part of the weekend for Red Bull. Just make sure they secure pole position. They don't necessarily really need Sergio Perez to be in the top 3 or 4 on the grid for them to protect themselves for the race. As long as they get pole position with Max, I don't think it really matters where Sergio Perez is on the grid. So yeah, Red Bull, they will be the quickest team this weekend. But watch out for qualifying, because if anyone is going to beat them this weekend, it's probably going to be qualifying where the chances of that is the most likely. But yeah, I still think ultimately, as long as they perform to their normal level, I just don't see them being beaten. And I see them winning yet another race, which would be, 12 wins in a row if they were to win this weekend. And of course, they would have won the first 11 races of the season. A truly incredible feat if they were to accomplish that this weekend. And next up, what I've decided to do, guys, and I'm going to do this from now on, is I've changed up the order of teams I go through. Now, based on what the actual Constructors' Championship positions are. So, next up is Mercedes-Benz. Mercedes, yeah, this weekend, even with a Red Bull's upgrade, I think Mercedes will be closer to Red Bull, at least in qualifying. I don't think they'll be, half a second or more away. Both drivers, Hamilton and Russell, supremely quick at this circuit. We saw last year George Russell getting his first ever pole position in Formula One. And of course, Lewis Hamilton, his teammate, has 8 race wins here in Hungary, and has always been unbelievably quick at the Hungaroring. So watch out for Mercedes, not just because of the drivers and their performance levels normally here in Hungary, but this car should be quite well suited to the track, especially after the upgrade they brought at Silverstone worked really well for them in improving their pace yet again. The new front wing they brought. And yeah, Mercedes looking a bit closer once again to Red Bull. But given now that Red Bull have brought this upgrade to the side pod, it might not seem after this weekend that Mercedes are necessarily closing the gap to Red Bull. But I still think Mercedes are getting there. They are definitely getting that gap down. But I don't see them as quick as McLaren here, especially if McLaren do indeed bring a upgrade to this weekend. The reason I'm doubtful with McLaren as to what they're bringing is because after Silverstone, there was talk, I think, from Andrea Stella that they might actually spread out whatever developments they've got left in the tank. They might spread it out over the last few European races rather than bringing it all to this race in Hungary. So we'll have to see exactly what McLaren do bring. But yeah, if McLaren, even if McLaren don't bring anything and Mercedes are not bringing anything, I don't see Mercedes as quick as McLaren. McLaren are quite clearly, right now, and I know certain people said, what I said after Silverstone was an overreaction, but I don't believe it's an overreaction at all. What we saw at Silverstone and the Red Bull Ring is pretty clear. McLaren are quicker than Mercedes, and McLaren are the fastest Mercedes-powered team. That is, I think, clear to see. Obviously, Lando was consistently quicker than both Mercedes and Aston Martin drivers in Austria, but then at Silverstone, both McLaren drivers were, well, comfortably quicker than Mercedes and Aston Martin, not just because of their own pace, but obviously because of the pace of the McLaren. So that's really going to be Mercedes' main fight this weekend, is against McLaren. If they can do well against McLaren, a bit better than I'm expecting them to do, then a double podium is definitely possible, which of course is what they got here last year, which if they were to replicate that, I think would be really the best weekend possible for them realistically. Obviously, winning the race, I just still think is a bit too far out of reach for them. But yeah, I think a double podium, definitely, if they, compared to McLaren, do a bit better than I expect, definitely possible. We will see how the Silver Arrows get on, but definitely when it comes to qualifying, watch out for Hamilton and Russell, because, yeah, we have seen some incredible pace from both of those drivers at this track in the past few years. And let's go on now to Aston Martin, falling away in the championship, third in the championship, pretty much smack bang in the middle of Mercedes and Ferrari in terms of what the gaps are from Aston Martin back to Ferrari and from Aston Martin up to Mercedes. Yeah, apparently they are bringing some upgrades this weekend. Not sure how many. I hope it's quite a bit, because what we saw at Silverstone was a team that is in desperate need of an upgrade to give them an extra 2 to 3 tenths of a second at least to get them back in the fight, because at the minute they're not really in the fight. They're closer really to the midfield than they are to being a front-running Formula 1 team that is fighting for podiums. They're just not quite in that area where they were obviously at the start of the season, where they were regularly finishing on the podium. And a lot of the time it was, because they were way too quick compared to Mercedes and Ferrari. And obviously the midfield teams behind them as well. So, yeah, really hope it's whatever upgrades they do bring, I hope it is big enough, because I need to see this team get back into the fight. And I want to see this man on screen, Fernando Alonso, back in the fight, because at Silverstone, I felt sorry for Fernando, because that track is a track he loves. He's always been incredibly quick there, but he didn't have a car to fight with. Mercedes and McLaren, and I know he finished ahead of the two Ferrari cars, but that was really because of Ferrari not being on the right tyres after the safety car. If the Ferraris were on the soft compound tyre, they would have passed Alonso pretty easily before the end of the race. So, yeah, a real shame about that for Fernando. And of course, this circuit, the Hungaroring, another circuit that Fernando loves dearly. He won here his first ever Formula 1, his first ever Formula 1 win here in Hungary 20 years ago, when he was just, 20 years old, for the Renault team. Absolutely dominated the race. I think he won by like a pit stop's gap of like 20 seconds or so. Absolutely dominated that race in what was a very fast Renault car that weekend. And he's also, had pole positions, I think, for Renault in other years as well. I think 2009 he had pole position for Renault, which was very impressive considering how bad Renault were that year. Even for Ferrari back in the day, when they would never really be that quick around this type of track, he would always be really pulling out some unbelievable speed to drag that car into really good positions. And even in his McLaren days, obviously the McLaren days I'm talking about was just a few years ago, even though this track suited that McLaren car a bit more than other tracks on the calendar, Fernando was always top of the midfield around this circuit. So as long as Aston Martin give him a car that is a bit better than what we saw at Silverstone compared to Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren, Fernando should have a good weekend. But if they don't give him a good enough car, then again, he's going to be more so focusing or fighting your Alpines and maybe even Haas cars if they're in the mix after a good qualifying. So I really hope they can improve this weekend. For Lance Stroll, the reason I've gone with him not finishing in the top 10 of qualifying or the race is because I don't think Lance is very quick around this circuit. I know he had a very good race here, I think a few years ago for Racing Point when they, were a really quick team. I think 2020, he was third on the grid, finished in fourth, I believe. That was really just a blip. Because if you look at the other years where Lance has raced here, he's never really showed, stunning amounts of pace as Lance Stroll. And of course, at the minute, he's in terrible form. So, yeah, that's why I've got Stroll outside of the top 10 in qualifying in the race. Even if Aston Martin are a bit better this weekend, I don't see that changing. But for Fernando Alonso, please, Aston Martin, give him a bit more of a fighting chance this weekend. And also, give yourselves a bit more of a fighting chance. Because, the start of the season was great. They were second in the championship, and now they're down to third. They're not out of the fight for second, but it's not looking really great, their chances, I would say, to finish in second, given that they've only got one driver to rely on. But if this form keeps up, Ferrari absolutely could overtake them in the next 2 or 3 races. And McLaren, given how quick they are at the minute, it's not impossible that they could catch them as well. And they do not want to be ending this season really where they were at the end of last season, which is more so at the front of the midfield. That's definitely not where they want to end this season. And I know, obviously, they want to focus on next year's car. That's great. But there's no guarantee that next year they're going to be any better than they were this year, comparatively, compared to, Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren, or even Alpine. So, yeah, I really hope they can get back in the fight this weekend. What we'll do is we'll go through a couple more teams, and then we'll get into your comments in the chat. Ferrari, as I've said, really already, this track layout just doesn't suit their car. Their car still, compared to McLaren, Mercedes, Red Bull, even Aston Martin, they don't have the downforce really to be competing for podiums or race wins right now. And that's why I don't think they're going to have a good weekend. We saw, even though their qualifying was not too bad with Carlos Sainz in Spain, which was the last high aero track we went to, in the race, their pace was not pretty bad, but they weren't really quick at all. They were slower than Mercedes and Red Bull by a pretty sizable margin. And I think we're only really quicker than Aston Martin because Aston Martin had an off weekend, rather than Ferrari being, that much quicker than Aston Martin when it came to that type of track layout. So, yeah, I just don't see Ferrari being quick here. The best hope is that Charles Leclerc, who normally for Ferrari is their best hope, and given Leclerc, especially in qualifying, is normally the better driver, if he can somehow drag his car into, the top 4 on the grid, then I think maybe then they would give themselves a chance of probably a bit of a better result than I'm expecting. But if he does qualify Leclerc 6th or worse, and that's the best that Ferrari can get in qualifying, then I really don't see how they can move forward from there and get anything that's really, or could be considered, a good race result. As we know, they still can't look after their tyres as well. Race pace is still an issue. And if they don't get a good enough qualifying position, then they will suffer in the race. So that's why I've gone from them 8th and 9th in the race, which would only be 6 points, of course. A very measly amount for them, given that they're trying desperately to catch Aston Martin and Mercedes ahead. But yeah, this is just an off track for them. It's just not the type of circuit where they're gonna, where they're, gonna do well compared to, tracks like Spa, Monza, Sao Paulo. Tracks like that. Las Vegas will be a track where I expect Ferrari to be very quick. Tracks like that where there's, a very high top speed is where they're going to be good. We know this. So yeah, if you're a Ferrari fan, just don't expect a lot. If you get like a top 5 finish in the race, I think you should be pretty happy with that. Unless Ferrari in qualifying proved to be really quick, then yeah. Let's now get on to McLaren finally, before we get into your comments in the chat. And yeah, McLaren, at the minute, are the second quickest Formula 1 team, as far as I'm concerned. In Austria, of course, they were the third best team, but I don't think that track really suited their car as much as the Silverstone circuit, where aero is a bit more important at Silverstone. I'd say Silverstone is probably a medium aero track. Really, to be the quickest team at Silverstone, you've got to have a good combo between good straight line speed and good aero, rather than just relying mostly on your straight line speed, like at the Red Bull Ring. That's why, of course, Ferrari was so quick there. Yeah, for McLaren here, obviously the Hungaroring, this track really should be the best type of track for the characteristics of their car right now, because downforce-wise, their car is, I think, definitely second best on the grid. Given that Red Bull have now brought their upgrade, they're probably still going to be second best on the grid in that aspect. They are definitely quicker than Mercedes and Aston Martin, the two other Mercedes-powered teams that they really have to fight with. Of course, we have Williams, but they don't have to fight really with Williams at all. So, yeah, McLaren looking very good going into the weekend, and I think there's a pretty good chance they could replicate what they did in qualifying at Silverstone and probably get the result at Silverstone in the race that they should have got, but get it here instead in Hungary, if that makes any sense, of course. But with Mercedes being a bit better and with their two drivers being so quick here, I think that makes their job a bit more difficult. But I would be very surprised if McLaren were not on the podium this weekend. Their car is definitely fast enough to be on the podium. It would take either really bad luck or a really poor driver performance for them to not be on the podium. And of course, they're two drivers performing at a very high level. Confidence is really high throughout the entire McLaren team. And it's looking very positive for McLaren. And even though I was hyping them up after the Silverstone Grand Prix, if they can get the result I predicted for them this weekend, 2nd and 5th in the race, I mean, that's 28 points. That is a massive amount of points. And if Aston Martin and Ferrari only get the amount of points that I predicted them to, which I think was 6 points for both, then they would very quickly start to catch those teams. So, yeah, McLaren looking very, very good. Lando Norris should be the main man for McLaren this weekend. Lando has always been very quick here. Again, with Oscar Piastri, the last time he raced here was in 2020, and that weekend it wasn't, showing stunning speed necessarily. So it's hard to say with Oscar really where he'll be. Practice tomorrow will definitely give us a good indicator as to how quick Oscar will be at the Hungaroring. But yeah, Lando Norris once again should be the main man for McLaren. And McLaren, again, second best team they should be. We'll see if Oscar Piastri can more so join the party and secure, again, the result they should have had at Silverstone, which is a double podium. McLaren, by the way, now they are back to being a front-running team. I should let you know that the last time McLaren were on the podium here in Hungary was in 2000 and 2012, I believe. Let me just think. Yeah, it was 2012. That was also the last time they won in Hungary. McLaren actually have a very rich history at the Hungaroring. They've always been very successful here back when they were a front-running team. Obviously, Lewis Hamilton won here, I think, 3 times for McLaren. Jenson Button won here for McLaren. Kimi Räikkönen won here for McLaren. I think Häkkinen won here a couple times as well for McLaren. I think Senna did as well. It's always been a very good race historically for the McLaren team. Let's hope they keep that up. But before we get into the rest of the teams, let's get into your comments in the chat. But quickly, before we do that, I just want to update you guys as to what my schedule is of content. Next 2 pieces of content on the channel this is. So tomorrow night, I'll be live at 8 p.m. UK time for the qualifying preview, where we'll go through all the data from practice to give us a good indication as to what's going to happen on Saturday. And then on Saturday, qualifying day, will be the usual content. Practice 3, F2 sprint race, and qualifying watch along. And I will be live from 11:15 a.m. until 4:30 p.m. Again, UK time that is. The same times as what the streams were at Silverstone. The only difference in timing is for Sunday, I'll be going live an hour earlier than I did on the race day at Silverstone, because the race day for Hungary starts an hour earlier here in the UK than it did for the British Grand Prix. So yeah, that's all the content coming up this weekend. Of course, there won't be a stream on Monday because it's a double header. So yeah, that's all the content coming up this weekend. And I just wanted to say, if you are new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. Bottom right of the screen, you can subscribe right there. And for everyone watching right now, make sure to smash that like button. Does, of course, help the channel in terms of growth. Currently on 15 likes. Let's try and get up to 25 plus if we can by the end of the stream. But before, like I said, we go on any further, let me get into some of your comments in the chat. And by the way, bye to Nib, who left the stream a few minutes ago. Hope he's doing well. I know he's super pumped at the minute because he is desperate to go and watch Oppenheimer, which I think releases in Australia. I don't know, is it tomorrow? Or might have already released in Australia. But I know in the UK, Oppenheimer releases tomorrow, and I will be going to see it probably next week. Actually, I am going to see it next week, aren't I? Yeah, next Tuesday. From what I heard, it's a really, really good film. I cannot wait to see it. Anyway, let's see what you guys are saying. Greetings, says Greg Martinez. Hello to all of you. McLaren F1 Race, Sparky P. Rob, yeah, great to see all of you in the chat. Sparky Pete says, one good thing about the new qualifying is we and all teams see other performance and degradation possibly with some math of every tyre, since they will all be forced to push and use each tyre. I mean, yeah, for the teams, that would be a good thing. You know, being able to know what the degradation will be. But for us, we won't really be able to understand what the degradation is like on those tyres, because we don't have the data that they do to calculate what the degradation would be like on average per lap after just using them for 2 or 3 laps or whatever. But like I said, I don't think the new qualifying tyre format is going to do anything. I think the problem is, and the reason I could see it being used again, this qualifying format, is because it's not going to add anything to the weekend. It's literally not going to add anything. There's nothing. I can't think of anything that it will. I can't think of any way that it will spice things up. I just cannot think of anything that using hard tyres in Q1, mediums in Q2, and softs in Q3. I just don't see how that could spice things up in any way. The problem, though, is not only will it not add anything, but it probably, because it won't make a difference, it also won't detract anything from the show. And that's why I believe it'll get used again. It's because they'll look at it and go, well, it didn't make anything worse, so why not keep it? That is what I'm fearful of. Is that because it won't make a difference at all, they'll claim that it was a success because it didn't make things worse, which is not the point of trialing new formats. If you're going to trial something, great, but it needs to be showing that it's definitely got the potential to be better than what we currently have. Rob says, why Leclerc Verstappen in the picture? Well, I think it's because in the background picture of my thumbnail, they're obviously racing side by side, so I thought it'd be good to have them in the thumbnail. Looking at recent performance, Leclerc doesn't even come close to deserve that. Well, that's not what I decide who's going to be on the thumbnail, to be honest. I mean, we have to remember, I know Leclerc finished 9th at Silverstone, but it was really because of his car and the team. Leclerc performed just fine, and he was running for quite a while in that race in 4th place. And then obviously it's not Silverstone, Austria. He finished 2nd in the race, looked very quick at times. So, yeah. Regardless is beginning to believe teams other than Red Bull will win at some point because Perez is leaving the door open like Bruno Mars and Anderson, lol. I have no idea what you mean by that. Sparky Pete says, if it's somewhat of a close call, I have some plausible deniability of bias for my team, Mercedes P2 and P3. I don't think P2 and P3 is really that big of a call, to be honest. I think it's definitely a possibility. Regara saying, whichever team between Ferrari, Aston Martin, and Mercedes lands probably big result first will probably finish 2nd. Depends what you mean by a big result, though. If you're talking in terms of, if Red Bull don't win every race this season, if one of them 3 break the streak, then I could see your point. But again, it depends what you mean by a big result, because, I mean, they've all had big results already so far. Josiah says McLaren are going to suck this weekend, I fear. I think you're being very pessimistic with that. Greg Martinez says, I don't care that Red Bull wins. The thing that grinds my gears being ahead 30 seconds from the rest. Large gaps between the top 5 and the rest is just boring. I agree. I agree completely. But one thing that does frustrate me online is the excuses that certain people make for certain eras of Formula One. And of course, these people that make these excuses, these certain eras, are the fans of certain teams and drivers. But, obviously Max Verstappen and Red Bull are dominating Formula One at the minute. That is clear to see. But this is not as dominant as what I've seen in Formula One since I started watching. Mercedes in 2014, 15 and 16 were more dominant than what Red Bull have been. And I know Red Bull, they've won an incredible amount of races since the start of 2022. They won, 17 races in 2022, and then so far this season 10. So that's 27 race wins out of 32 races? That is a lot, obviously. But when you look at the pace difference last year and this year, it's not even close to what Mercedes had in 2014, 15 and 16. And I know we had Hamilton and Rosberg fighting each other sometimes, but they weren't fighting each other all the time. And a lot of the time, it was just the Mercedes show. and they would be, not half a second quicker than the rest, but a lot of the time, close to a second quicker than the rest of the field. So, yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't like, obviously, people winning by massive amounts and there being massive gaps through the field, because I want there to be exciting races. That's why I love Formula 1, is because when I started watching Formula 1, the gaps through the field were a lot closer in, obviously, 2012, which was the first season that I watched. The gaps, again, were a lot closer through the field. And there was always competition going on. But, when you get to the point where it's massive gaps between loads of teams, then, yeah, it does become very boring. But I'm not going to but I'm not going to moan about how boring a certain team's domination is purely because it's a certain team, is the point I'm trying to make. I don't care that Red Bull are dominating. There's always going to be a team dominating. One thing that is annoying as well in the online space, in the F1 community, is, and I think a lot of this has come from what happened in 2021, where we had such a close, exciting season. People, for some reason, now believe that that is what F1 is. It's not. That's why 2021 was so exciting, is because that is not the norm. We don't normally get a season like that. Normally, one team or one driver dominates the season. That's how Formula 1 has always been, whether it's been Red Bull now, Mercedes, Red Bull a decade ago, Ferrari, McLaren, Williams, Lotus. You go back to even the 1950s as well. That's always... It's not even Formula 1. If you look at sports, most of the time in sports, there is one team dominating. Whether it's Manchester City in football, in, say, English football. In basketball, you'll have dynasties, Chicago Bulls, Lakers, Warriors, the San Antonio Spurs. That's what annoys me about people who maybe don't understand as much about whether it's Formula 1 or sports in general. Domination happens most of the time in sports. That's just the way it is. So, as much as we don't like it and they moan about certain teams dominating, it's not like we're not used to it. It's just the way things are. And going out of your way to ensure that domination cannot be had, I really do not think there is justification for stuff like that. For example, like we see in WEC, where they have the balance of performance thing, where if one team starts dominating a bit, they bring them a bit back, down to earth, which I really hate. Because, what's the point of being good if you're, if you're going to be curtailed? It's just a really stupid thing, in my opinion. Right, let's find a couple more comments, I reckon, and then we'll get onto the midfield teams here in Hungary. Looney Classics says, having high downforce does not necessarily mean McLaren will be second best. Last week, Lando said the car will still struggle in low-speed corners, which are plenty this weekend. Did Lando actually say that? I'd be curious to know if he did. I didn't see he did say that. Not saying you're lying, but I'd just be interested to see that quote. There are slow corners here in Hungary, but there's not as many here as there is at like Baku, where every corner pretty much is a slow or medium speed corner. The reason I say McLaren are going to be second best is because, as we clearly saw at Silverstone, McLaren were quicker than Ferrari. And that wasn't because McLaren had better straight line speed or anything. is because McLaren have better downforce, had more grip than Ferrari did. And then when you compare it to the Mercedes works team and Aston Martin, well, of course, there can't be a massive or significant straight line speed advantage compared to those teams because they're all powered by the same power unit. So it has to come down to downforce. And as we saw at Silverstone, McLaren were clearly quicker than Mercedes and Aston Martin. So that's why I say McLaren will be second best this weekend. Not, it's not a guarantee, but I'd be very surprised if I was proven, if McLaren ended up being like the fourth best team, I'd be very surprised by that, put it that way. And I'll read out what a couple comments from Michael got, and then we'll move on. By the way, hello to Ron. He says hello from Wisconsin. Hope you're doing well. Michael says, is parity on the grid too difficult to achieve in F1? Could it ever be possible to a point of equal competition between at least 3 to 4 teams? Well, the current regulations we have, I think, are pushing us more in that direction, because Red Bull at the start of this season were miles clear of the rest of the field. And I know Red Bull, they've brought this upgrade now and that their pace will probably improve. But I mean, look at qualifying in Silverstone. You had you had 4 teams within half a second of each other in qualifying. Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes. And I think the entire top 10 was within a second of each other, which is really good. Because, I mean, if you go back to 2018, and of course, the current regulations we have of the budget cap, but also the ATR rules about, you can only do so many runs in the wind tunnel. Obviously, if you finish higher in the championship, you can only do so many when teams that finish lower in the championship can do quite a bit more. And that's what has brought the field a lot closer together. That's why McLaren are now up in the fight, because of those regulations helping that. But I mean, yeah. If we look at the 2018 British Grand Prix, we had the entire top 10 was covered by 2.3 seconds, when, again, at Silverstone, a couple weeks ago, it was only covered by a second. And then if you compare it to let's go to the last British Grand Prix before these regulations came into force properly, which would have been 2020. The gap from pole position to P10 for the 2020 British Grand Prix was 2 seconds. And I mean, Mercedes were nearly a second quicker than Max Verstappen in third. So that's, the current regulations we got are helping that without a doubt. And it will, between now and when the 2026 regulations come around, that gap will get closer. There is absolutely no doubt about it. Red Bull are not going to be, I really think, at any point between now and the end of 2025, Red Bull are never going to be a second a lap quicker than the rest of the field. That's just not going to happen, because they don't have enough time in the wind tunnel to develop something that could give them that advantage. They just don't. There's not enough time or money with these regulations for them to be able to build that gap. So, in terms of parity on the grid, I think absolutely we are heading towards that type of, what we had back in 2012 to a degree, where we had, say, 3 to 4 front-running teams regularly fighting for the race win or podium. Or even if you go back to like the early 1980s, where we had Williams, Brabham, Ferrari, and Renault, who were all, and Lotus, I think to a degree as well. All fighting for, the wins and the podiums. And the early 1980s was very, the competition was very, very close. I think we're not that far away from getting to that type of field in Formula One where the top 3 or 4 teams are regularly separated by not that much. Michael also says, don't mind dynasties, but because that's been earned and the other competitors have to catch up. I just don't like long dynasties. Yeah, I see what you mean. It can get boring. There's no doubt about that. And I don't dislike dominance necessarily. I mean, it can, of course, lead to less quality racing because, of course, the field spread is bigger. If there's one team dominating a lot more than, or has a massive gap compared to the cars behind them. But yeah, I think I said this a few weeks ago. Was it a couple weeks ago or 3 weeks ago? I can't remember exactly when it was, but I do actually think that domination in certain periods is actually good for certain sports because it raises the level of the competitors. I mean, look at Formula One, for example. With Mercedes and how amazingly good their power unit was in 2014, it forced Renault, Ferrari, and Honda to go all out to try and close that gap. I mean, Ferrari did with illegal means, but then eventually did close the gap to them in that area. Honda, of course, eventually got there just about. Renault, to a degree, got there as well, and it's because Mercedes being that strong in that area forced those manufacturers to improve so much. When if the Mercedes power unit was only as good as the Renault or the Ferrari in 2014, there wouldn't have been such a mad rush necessarily to increase the power. Or, again, you can compare it to other sports. If you have one team dominate for a couple seasons in football where they're so far ahead of the rest, it forces the other teams to recruit better players a lot quicker than they would normally, to close that gap a lot quicker than they were maybe planning to. And again, raises the quality of competition. One great example of this in the Premier League here in England is when Man City won the league in 2018. They were the first ever team to finish with, I think it was 101 points. They were like 20 points clear of Man United, fucking 30 points clear of the rest below them. Dominated the season. They were impossible to play against for pretty much everyone where they were playing at their peak. And then a season or two after that, teams like Liverpool, Tottenham to a certain extent, and then us a couple years after that, we, got closer to them, and it raised the level of all of the other top teams in England to the point where England, really since 2018 or 2019, has been the, we have the strongest league in the world because of that domination that helped raise the quality so much. So, and I think with F1 again, if I touch back on F1, I think that's what, to a degree, made 2021 so exciting. Because Mercedes had dominated for so long, Red Bull knew, and Max Verstappen knew, they had to be so good and so consistent if they wanted to win the championship. They couldn't afford to have off weekends. They had to be on it every session of the weekend, every weekend, for the, obviously, entire season. And that's what made 2021 so exciting, but so high quality, because Red Bull knew they could not really take a breath. They had to just go absolutely hammer and tong to try and take that championship away. And of course they did, in very controversial circumstances. But again, the quality of the championship fight was truly incredible. Rob saying, I must say I admire your dedication to doing these streams. Cheers for that. Darth Lord Raven. Prediction. How many championships will Max win in total? And Darth Lord Raven has asked that in the form of a super chat. Thank you very much for that, of €2. Massively appreciated. In total, well, he's got, at the end of this year, he'll have 3. Probably by the end of 2025, he'll have 5 in total. I think he'll probably end up with 7 or 8. I'm not sure exactly. It's too hard to say because we don't know how the Red Bull powertrain / Ford partnership after 2026, we don't know how that's going to work out. Red Bull might be terrible. It could be definitely a scenario that plays out. That could really hamper Max Verstappen, trying to break all records in front of him. But of course, Max has talked about how when his contract at Red Bull ends in 2028, he's talked about how, if I get to that point, and I haven't got anything more really to accomplish, then he might decide to step away from Formula One. And in 2028, Verstappen would be what? 30, 31? Something like that. So, given that he would have been in Formula One for about 14 years nearly, I don't think it would necessarily be that big of a surprise if he's already won 7 or 8 championships by then. But yeah, it's difficult to say because let's say he signs a new contract at Red Bull to stay until, I don't know, 2032 or 2033. But Red Bull at that particular time are not as dominant or as good as they are now. Then who knows what he'll end up with. But from what I can, say now, I'd probably say 7 or 8 championships. I just don't know exactly how many, because again, it's too hard to say. But I think he will be, by the end of 2025, as long as Red Bull keep evolving this car, this design, this brilliant design, brilliant machine they have, because of course the regulations for next year and 2025 are basically the same. As long as they keep evolving it at a good rate and they don't fall behind or stall on upgrades, then Max really should win the title this year, next year, and in 2025, which would make him a 5-time world champion. And he'd probably have, by the end of 2025, the 3rd most wins in Formula One history. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, records-wise, championships-wise, all of that, where he ends up by the time his current contract comes to an end. But Mike asking, how long do you think Red Bull domination will continue? In terms of championships, I think really until the end of 2025. I don't think necessarily Red Bull are going to be this quick compared to the rest of the field next year or the year after. But I think in terms of who wins the titles, again, I think it could be the same as what we're seeing this year, but just it'll be a lot more of a competitive fight for those championships than what we've seen this year. So, yeah, end of 2025 is when I think that domination will end. And then 2026, who knows? Obviously, the biggest change to the power units that we've ever seen will be taking place in 2026. Them removing the MGUH and really electrifying the power units. Also, talking of 2026, there was some information that came out from Let me just find him a minute. From Toby Grunner, who works for Automotor and Sport. And what do you call it? An Automotor and Sport, you guys may have heard it before. I've showed their articles on stream before. The information they report normally is quite accurate. He reported some interesting stuff about 2026, which was actually very positive. So according to this article they did, the 2026 cars have to use only 30 kilograms of fuel to generate electric power. According, that is, to latest calculations. And of course, still 2.5 years away from 2026. So maybe that will change. The wheelbase is set to be shortened by 30 centimeters. And the new gearbox will only have 6 gears instead of 8. So, yeah, 2026 is going to be a massive new set of regs. Massive new set of regs. Not just for the engines, but the dimensions of the car. So, it's going to be definitely it's definitely going to be an exciting year that year to see who comes out with the best package. Of course, we'll have so many manufacturers. It'll be, what do you call it? It'll be what? You have Red Bull Powertrain / Ford. Honda obviously will be powering Aston Martin. And then obviously Mercedes, Ferrari, Renault, Audi. So yeah, it's going to be 2026. It's going to be very, very exciting. And also, talking of news outside of the outside of what's going on right now, the FIA, it was announced, I think on Monday, that the FIA is set to accept Andretti's bid to enter the grid for, I think, 2025 is when they want to enter. And apparently, they are also set to accept another team coming onto the grid, which we believe is High Tech. Now, you may know, High Tech have junior teams. They have a team in Formula 2, for example, that I think... who races for High Tech in Formula 2? Let me just quickly check. But they're actually based at Silverstone, or the High Tech team. And yeah, they've got, Isaac Hadjar and Jack Crawford. In Formula 3, they've got Juan Pablo Montoya's son, Sebastian, in their car. Also, some other very exciting prospects lower than that as well. But, yeah. And actually, what was it? Yeah, I'm just seeing this article now. I think I might have talked about this a couple of weeks ago. This was reported by motorsport.com on June the 26th that High Tech has formally confirmed that it has lodged an entry to join the grid in 2026 after revealing a major new investment deal. So, looks like we're going to have not one, but 2 new teams on the grid. And the vital thing for those 2 teams coming to the grid is there are definitely teams that don't support new teams coming to the grid purely for greed, because they'll get less of a share of the pie. But one thing that really helps them is there is a certain big manufacturer that is on their side purely because it means those new teams coming to the grid means that those teams will use their power units going forward, and that is Renault. Because of course at the minute, the only Renault powered team is Alpine, which is basically Renault. So Renault are on board. They absolutely have no problem with Andretti and High Tech coming to the grid. Apparently Andretti, if you believe what they said about a year ago, Renault have already agreed to power them if they come onto the grid. So, yeah, looking good. Looking very good. 24 cars on the grid, that would be honestly a great sight. And I don't think, as long as we kept it at 24 cars, or even 26 cars, I think, to be honest, we wouldn't have to worry about certain drivers missing out on seats or have to complain about there's not enough seats in Formula 1 if we were to get 4 more cars on the grid. Vinster, yeah, saying, I think Andretti is in. Hope they're competitive right out of the box, but we'll see. I mean, their chances of success in Formula 1, I think, is better than what we've seen with Haas, because Andretti, they're just a better, from what I've seen, again, I'm not the most educated guy in American motorsport, but they do seem to be a higher quality racing organization, Andretti, than Haas are. So, yeah. I think Andretti have got a good chance of being something quite decent in Formula 1. And, you know, maybe if they could hire some really good people, who's to say Andretti couldn't be a front-running Formula 1 team? Of course, Liberty Media would love that. Given that, of course, they're American, and that would really increase American popularity. That's really what's missing for Liberty Media if they really want to increase American popularity, is an American team that is one of the top 4 or 5 teams on the grid. Right, final comment I'll read out before I move on from Michael Gott. Out of the present back markers, which team do you think in the near future could be in the best shape to make it to the front of the grid, if any? Probably Williams, because with Haas, they're still too reliant on Ferrari, and I think they're still doing their thing with Dallara as well. And I just don't think their plan is really sustainable for success in Formula 1. Alfa Romeo, of course, they're going to become Audi. So, I mean, it'd be unfair, really, to say that they're going to be the team to break out of that back marker pack, because, to join the front runners, because obviously they're going to be a works team in 2026. AlphaTauri is always going to be Red Bull's junior team, and they'll only ever be so good. But yeah, with Williams, how they've improved, and if they can keep this improvement up, I don't see why they can't be, maybe not next year, but in 2 or 3 years, maybe fighting for 5th, 6th in the championship. I don't think that's completely out of the possibility, especially if, and I don't think it's confirmed yet that they are going to be Mercedes powered in 2026, but if they are, and Mercedes really get it bang on with the 2026 power unit, who's to say Williams won't be one of the top 4 or 5 teams on the grid? It could be possible. Anyway, thanks for all the comments, but we'll move on quickly and finish up the rest of the teams. As you can see here, Nico Hülkenberg with the Barbie-style haircut and hair colour. If I just go back to Hülkenberg, I mean, yeah, he does look a bit like Ken from Barbie, but I don't know, he looks a bit like a 1980s bad movie supervillain to me. It's got that type of like 80s villain hair type of look. I think some of you older guys, I think you'll know what I mean by that, because there are a couple films where like the villain's got like really, really blonde hair like this. So yeah, it does look a bit funny, but it suits him, to be fair. Anyway, let's now move on to the rest of the teams. Alpine, it appears they have a new front wing, but I think if that's their only upgrade this week, and I don't really see that having enough of an effect to put them really in the fight with McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, or Aston Martin. So really, their fight is going to be somehow getting into the top 10, which is going to be very difficult, trust me. Their fight will be with, Lance Stroll in the second Aston Martin, who was looking very slow. the Williams of Alex Albon to a certain extent, and then probably the two Haas drivers. I expect Haas to be a bit better off this weekend than what we saw at Silverstone. So, yeah, Alpine, really that's who their fight is with. But one thing I need to quickly get into with Alpine is... Let me find it, because Otmar Safnauer came out and said something so stupid the other day. I just have to talk about it. I'm trying to find where it is. It was like the most like failing to admit the truth type of comment that I've seen. I'm just seeing here, yeah, Otmar Safnauer admitted McLaren's improved pace has caught Alpine by surprise. However, he revealed that his team have some upgrades coming in the next couple of races that should see them, quote, go well. Let's hope so. Yeah, this was it. This was the comment. So, Safnauer does not believe that the team have taken a step back to their competitors. And while Safnauer does not believe that the team has taken a step back compared to their competitors, it is clear that they have taken a step back. What is he talking about? In Monaco, they got a podium, which was mostly on performance, why they got that podium. And that was, what, 2 months ago? And now they're nowhere near really in the position where they could hope to finish on the podium. It is pretty clear to see. And then he went on to say, quote, I have to look after this, but we are closer to Mercedes and Ferrari, and we have maintained our relative difference to Red Bull. I mean, are they closer to Red Bull? Probably, but they're not. This is what's annoying. He's like picking and choosing certain bits of data from certain parts of the season to make it seem like Alpine are not doing as bad as they actually are. Because, again, in Monaco, Alpine were as quick as... Maybe not as quick as Ferrari, because I think Ferrari in clear air in Monaco were probably quicker. But they were competitive with Ferrari, and they were quicker than Mercedes. They were miles quicker than McLaren. But apparently, you know, they're just as close to Mercedes and Ferrari. It just doesn't make any fucking sense to me, what he's trying to say. Again, it's like he's... cherry-picking data to justify that Alpine are not in a bad position when they clearly are, compared obviously to where they were earlier in the season. Let's hope that they will improve as the season goes on. But yeah, for this weekend, Pierre Gasly, I expect to be ahead of Esteban Ocon. Gasly is more consistently quick here than Ocon is. Ocon also can be quick here, of course, won here 2 years ago in a mental race. Yeah, Gasly has proved to be very quick here in the past for Toro Rosso / AlphaTauri. So, yeah, watch out for Gasly if there is a surprise to be sprung from the Alpine team. But most likely they are the 6th best team and at best will get one car into, I don't know, 9th or 10th on the grid. Williams, obviously, amazing race they had at Silverstone, but I don't think they're going to replicate that here. I really hope, though, that they can prove that that pace at Silverstone was not a one-off, because it was great to see them so quick, fighting with Aston Martin and Ferrari at the end of that race, and scoring such vital points, 4 points, to take them up to 7th in the championship. So important for them. But yeah, this weekend, I just don't see that result being possible. The track layout doesn't suit their car. Next weekend at Spa, they should be a dark horse for a really strong result, I think. But this weekend, they're probably going to struggle to be in the top 10. So yeah, don't really get your hopes up about the Williams team. But let's see in practice how they do. Because, of course, we said this coming into the British Grand Prix weekend. then Albon was in the top 3 in both practice 1 and practice 2. So yeah, we will see how they get on. Haas F1. Yeah, maybe their qualifying performance won't be as good as what we saw at Silverstone, but I think overall, definitely in the race, I think we'll see a better performance from this team than what we got a couple of weeks ago. The mission now, though, between now and the end of the season for Haas has to be to beat Williams in the championship. I don't think they have to worry really that much about Alfa Romeo and AlphaTauri, because I think Haas have clearly got a good pace advantage over those teams, at least in qualifying, to the point where, yeah, they don't have to worry about those teams, beating them to vital points positions. And of course, Alfa Romeo and AlphaTauri are nowhere near the people that are regularly scoring points like Red Bull, McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, Aston Martin, and to a degree, Alpine as well. So, yeah, Haas, it is now their fight to take to Williams for 7th in the championship. Most likely, Williams will win that fight because Haas still, no matter how quick they are on a Saturday, still cannot solve their race pace woes on a Sunday. And that's really why they're not far clear in 7th place. Because if they were as quick on a Sunday as they are on a Saturday, Haas would be still pretty comfortably in 7th place, and they would probably be not that far away from Alpine ahead of them. But yeah, they've just not solved that issue, and they're probably never going to solve that issue, are the Haas F1 team, unfortunately. But yeah, this weekend, the best I can see, probably a double Q2 appearance, and then probably just a terrible race result because of that lack of pace with heavy fuel. Alfa Romeo, this track should be better for them than what we saw at Silverstone. They do tend to be better off at higher aero tracks. The last time we went to one, they actually scored points, with Zhou Guanyu finishing in P9. But given how certain teams have improved since then, I don't think we'll be seeing that this weekend. So yeah, Alfa Romeo, best I can see is maybe Valtteri Bottas getting into Q2, but other than that, they will be pretty shit, and so will AlphaTauri, who, of course, Daniel Ricciardo makes his return to Formula One with. If Ricciardo can somehow make it into Q2 and then finish the race in, 12th or 13th, and be ahead of Tsunoda, that would be a really great first weekend back in Formula One. But he does have his work cut out for him, because this car is right now the worst car on the grid. Not by far. They're still competitive with Alfa Romeo and Haas, at least on a Sunday. But they're just not really anywhere near fighting for a point right now like they were a couple months ago. So yeah, it's going to be a tricky time for Ricciardo. Luckily, though, this Grand Prix track is one of Ricciardo's good tracks. So if he is to really come back with a bang, then this, coming back at this circuit really does help. Obviously, won here in 2014, took what is, for me, his best ever race win. Has regularly been very quick here. And yeah, it's just been always, for whatever team he's driving for or whatever car he's driving, he's always been very, very quick in whatever, fight that he is in. And actually, 10 years ago at this same race, maybe not for a team that was as quick at the time, he was racing, of course, for the same team that back then was named Toro Rosso, and he did actually make it surprisingly into Q3, back in a era where Ricciardo was regularly surprising people by making it into Q3. And that's really what got him the Red Bull seat in 2014. And of course, the rest is history. But yeah, Ricciardo, I think, again, just making it into Q2 and then finishing 12th or 13th, I think that would be a really great weekend for him. Because he would probably have to beat both Williamses, when the Williams car is clearly quicker. Probably one of the Alpines. and maybe even the Aston Martin of Lance Stroll if he was to get one of those 2 positions in the race. So, yeah, that would be, I think, a very good weekend for Ricciardo. But let's see on Friday, compared to Tsunoda, how he does and whether he is properly up to speed. Of course, there was much talk about Ricciardo being very quick in the test that they did at Silverstone, and that's really what confirmed him getting the drive at AlphaTauri for the rest of the year. Obviously now we're going to find out for real, is his pace back to what we saw 3 or 4 years ago? If it is, fucking fantastic, because we have missed the real Daniel Ricciardo. But those guys are all the teams and how I think they'll get on. Of course, 2 practice sessions tomorrow. And of course, after those 2 practice sessions, I will be live with my qualifying preview, live tomorrow night, 8 PM UK time, where we'll go through all of the data from practice 2, look at who was quick, who wasn't, and get into what most likely will happen in qualifying. And also, we will officially go through all of the upgrades for all the teams. And then on Saturday, I'll be live throughout qualifying day for the Practice 3, F2 sprint race, and qualifying watch-along. Live on Saturday from 11:15 AM till 4:30 PM UK time. And of course, on Sunday, I'll be live at 12 PM UK time, all the way through until probably 4:30 PM. The race preview, race watch along, and race reaction. So if you want to join for that, guys, if you are new to the channel, make sure to subscribe. Before you go, make sure to smash that like button. Actually, a couple things I'll do before I go. Just a quick update about the weather for this weekend. So tomorrow, to be honest, tomorrow we could get a wet practice too, which would certainly spice things up for the rest of the weekend. The chance of rain during when practice 2 is supposed to be is quite high, 80% by the looks of it. So yeah, that's not great. And yeah, looking at the forecast, it looks like it is going to be wet for practice 2. Saturday still looks dry and sunny mostly. And then Sunday definitely will be dry and sunny. I think Sunday is, by far the hottest day, 30 degrees Celsius. And I don't think there'll be any clouds around either on Sunday if I just look on the forecast. And no, it will just be a clear sunny day on Sunday. So, yeah, it's really Friday at the minute. Looks like it's been the day that is most affected by wet weather. Just want to update you guys, of course, about that. And quickly before I go, let me end this poll in chat where I asked you guys who is most likely to challenge Red Bull this weekend at the 2023 Hungarian Grand Prix. And you guys have voted with Mercedes with 41% of the vote, McLaren second, Aston Martin third, Ferrari in fourth. Thank you guys for voting if you did. But what do you call it? But yeah, that is pretty much the end of the stream. Thank you guys, of course, for coming along, and make sure to join me tomorrow for the qualifying preview. I will admit, though, if both sessions are wet and the forecast for Saturday still is showing as dry, there is a chance I might cancel the qualifying preview. But again, depends on how the weather plays out, so we'll see how that all shakes out tomorrow in Budapest. But yeah, make sure to join me for that tomorrow, and obviously the content on Saturday and Sunday. Yeah, make sure before you go, smash a like button. Let's get the likes up as much as we can, over 40 likes if we can before we go. And as well, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at ChazHD5 if you want to keep up the content on the channel. And if you want to join our community and get good notifications for when I go live and channel updates and stuff like that, make sure to join our Discord server, linked below in the description for all of that stuff. But guys, until my qualifying preview tomorrow night, and until the rest of the 2023 Hungarian Grand Prix weekend, It has been me, Chazza HD. Goodbye.